Joining us now in Washington, D.C., Paul Fraser, a former Canadian diplomat, now a senior advisor with the Washington-based consulting firm 3-Click Solutions and specialist in Canada-U.S. relations. And joining us from Toronto is Chris Sands, who is an American, by the way, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He, too, specializes in Canada-U.S. relations. Gentlemen, this could be sold as a win-win solution. Americans get more security. Canada gets a more permeable border. Is it win-win? Anyone want to argue for or against?
Well, I think it's win-win in both ways. That is to say, I think Canadians and Americans get enhanced border security, perimeter security, where we need to enhance that. And both Canadians and Americans also get enhanced freedom at the border in terms of the legitimate crossing of goods, services, and people.
Chris Sands?
Well, and I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that, Dan. I think that when we came out after 9/11, the United States looking for Canada to do something like a perimeter, the Chrétien government said, that's a little too scary for us. Let's take it slow. And the U.S. fortified the bilateral border, the U.S.-Canadian border, with big consequences. But over the years, Canadian governments and U.S. governments have worked together to create really an effective perimeter. The Container Security Initiative on shipping containers, the sharing of terrorist watch lists to make sure we're screening for some of the same things, looking at international intelligence data, etc. So we've been moving in this direction, but Canada never got the benefit. They never got the lowering of security on the bilateral border that you would expect as part of this exchange. So what this does takes us a little bit further on the idea, but mostly it gives Canadians what they've been wanting, which is a climb down a little bit, we'll see how far, on the bilateral border.
Would it be fair to say that Canadians have for a very long time thought we should have a special relationship with the Americans? We've been their best friend for such a very long time, and we're very pleasant at the border. And yet we haven't had a special relationship. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Well, I'm not quite sure, because I'm speaking as someone who comes from the border. I grew up in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and typical of those communities all across. There's no question 9/11 was a great punch to the solar plexus. Since then, Chris is quite correct. The Canadian and American officials have worked very, very closely and very effectively. But the Canadians and the Americans have some common, serious national interests here, and they're not just trade related and they're not just security related, but as former Deputy Prime Minister and also U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge noted in their action plan a number of years ago, that the economic and the security are totally entwined, and that hasn't diminished since that period. So I think that the Canadians and the Americans are now at the point where the political atmosphere is permitting a more honest and open discussion of something called perimeter security, something that Perrin Beatty and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, for example, have been touting, as have other organizations for some time. So I'm quite pleased that we're getting to the point where, if reports are true, we actually will have an announcement of a vision and then a challenge to officials on both sides of the border to get on with it.
Mr. Sands, in the United States, folks have been pretty security conscious for a lot of years now. It's been job one in the minds of many people. Will this be a tough sell, softening of a border?
I don't think so, because I don't think it'll be sold as a softening of the border. For example, one of the things that we've talked about between the United States and Canada for some time is exit controls, to make sure the people you want deported actually deport. And the U.S. has been working on that since 1996. Some Canadians will remember the Section 110 debate that we had prior to September 11, trying to get Canada to help us with the people leaving the country. And Canadians, of course, concerned that these extra checks were going to slow the border down so much that it would really hurt trade. Well, we're still trying to get that. But last year, the Auditor General in Canada said that Canadian officials were unaware of the status of up to 40,000 immigration bench warrants that had been issued for individuals who were supposed to leave the country or come for a final hearing and had just gone AWOL. They disappeared. So Canada, I think, in its own security reviews, has come up with some of the same concerns that American officials have. And as those two things have come together, I think we're looking at ways that we, rather than fortifying the border, can exchange information. So, for example, the people who enter Canada are the people who leave the U.S., and the people who leave the U.S. are the people who enter Canada. changing our entry data, we can cover exit and save a lot of money and make the border much easier to cross. Things like that are, part and parcel of what you would expect from a special relationship, but it's taken us a while to see the world in the same way and have the capability to have this conversation. So it's definitely a positive development.
Speaking of hard sells, Mr. Fraser, what about the Canadian political and cultural sensitivities in getting too close to the Americans? When we hear we're going to have to further harmonize between the United States and Canada, militaries, police, border security, exchanges of information, a lot of Canadians get a little nervous.
Well, I think those kinds of general concerns will always be with us just by virtue of the nature of the geopolitical situation, where we're located, who we are. That having been said, I would remind Canadians and Americans that on 9/11, the officer in charge of what we call NORAD, traditionally North American Air Defense Command, was a Canadian military officer. That is the degree of interoperability and trust and confidence that has existed for a long time between Canada and the United States. And I would think that once officials on both sides of the border are charged with coming up with an action plan that's in fact doable, this will enhance the public discussion. And everybody who has various concerns can put them forward publicly, and these can be addressed as best as they can in the national interest of Canada as well as in the national interest of the United States.
So this is not something that's going to happen overnight?
It wouldn't seem to,
no,
although I don't know just when this announcement will take place. But if reports are correct, once that does occur, then I believe it would be about 4 months, a time period in which a binational group will be charged with coming up with some kind of action plan.
Paul Fraser in Washington, Chris Sands in Toronto. Thank you very much, gentlemen.